I want you to imagine believing you survived the worst thing that could ever happen to you. The bombs have stopped. The shooting has ended. Your emperor, the living god you were taught to die for, has just told you to lay down your weapons. You're alive. Against all odds, you made it through World War II. You think the nightmare is over. You have no idea it's just beginning. Because what happened to over 600,000 Japanese soldiers after August 15, 1945, wasn't relief. It wasn't homecoming. For most of them, it was something worse than death in battle. And if you want to understand how a nation treats its warriors when they're no longer useful, stay with me, because this story will change how you think about what happens when wars actually end. On August 8, 1945, something happened that Japanese soldiers in Manchuria never saw coming. The Soviet Union, which had maintained a neutrality pact with Japan throughout most of World War II, suddenly declared war. Within hours, over 1.5 million Soviet troops poured across the border into Japanese-occupied Manchuria. This wasn't a gradual military operation. This was a massive, coordinated invasion that Soviet commanders had been planning in secret for months. The Japanese Kwantung Army stationed in Manchuria had once been the pride of the imperial military, over 1 million men strong, battle-hardened from years of fighting in China. But by August 1945, that army existed mostly on paper. Japan's best soldiers and equipment had already been transferred to defend the Pacific Islands against the Americans. What remained in Manchuria were mostly inexperienced conscripts, support personnel, and older reservists. They were overrun in days. Admiral Otozo Yamada, commanding the Kwantung Army, found himself facing an impossible situation. His troops were scattered across a territory the size of Texas, with broken supply lines, obsolete equipment, and virtually no air support. The Soviets weren't just advancing, they were encircling entire divisions before they could even organize defensive positions. Then, on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radio broadcasts throughout the empire. It was the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their emperor speak. His message was carefully worded, using formal court language that many soldiers struggled to understand. But the meaning was unmistakable. Japan was surrendering. For soldiers raised on the doctrine that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, this was psychologically incomprehensible. Their training had been explicit: die rather than surrender. Capture was worse than death. A true soldier of the empire would choose suicide over the shame of laying down his weapon. But the emperor himself had commanded them to surrender. How do you reconcile those contradictions when your entire identity is built on absolute obedience? Soviet soldiers moving through Manchuria began encountering something they had rarely seen in their battles against Germany: mass surrenders. Unlike the Pacific Islands, where Japanese soldiers fought to the last man, in Manchuria they capitulated in the tens of thousands. This wasn't cowardice. This was confusion, meeting exhaustion, meeting a direct imperial command. The Soviets weren't prepared for this either. Taking prisoners was one thing. Processing, housing, and feeding over 600,000 captured soldiers and civilians was a logistical nightmare on a scale that even Soviet military planners hadn't anticipated. Soviet troops began rounding up prisoners in collection points across Manchuria. The captured men were divided roughly into groups of 1,000, stripped of personal possessions, and told they would be processed before being sent home. The Soviet soldiers spoke to them in Russian. Most Japanese didn't understand the words, but they understood the general message being communicated: Domoi, Tokyo, home to Tokyo. Many Japanese soldiers believed it. After all, the war was over. Prisoners get processed and repatriated. That's what happens when wars end, right? What they didn't know was that on August 23, 1945, just 3 days after the Kwantung Army officially surrendered, Joseph Stalin had signed a secret decree. It had a bureaucratic title: on receiving and accommodating the Japanese army prisoners of war and utilizing them for labor. The Japanese weren't being processed for repatriation. They were being inventoried for enslavement. Between late August and October 1945, over 600,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians were loaded onto train cars, cattle cars actually, and transported not south toward Japan, but north and west into the Soviet Union. The trains traveled for days, sometimes weeks. Prisoners received almost no food during transport. They had no idea where they were going or why. When the train doors finally opened, what many Japanese soldiers saw was unlike anything their tropical and temperate homeland had prepared them for: Siberia. If you think you understand what happened to these men during what became known as the Siberian internment, I need you to subscribe right now. Because what I'm about to tell you goes far beyond what most history books cover. The details that survived, documented in diaries, Soviet archives declassified decades later, and the testimonies of the 60% who eventually made it home, reveal a systematic destruction of human beings that Stalin's government treated as just another resource extraction operation. The Soviet Union in 1945 needed bodies more than it needed justice. World War II had killed approximately 27 million Soviet citizens, military and civilian combined. Entire regions had been devastated, cities were ruins, agricultural areas had been stripped, industrial capacity had been redirected entirely toward war production for 4 years. The infrastructure of the Soviet state was shattered. Stalin saw the captured Japanese as a solution to multiple problems simultaneously. They were skilled labor that didn't need to be paid. They were enemy soldiers who could be punished while being useful. And most importantly, they were politically expendable. No one in the international community was going to protest loudly about what happened to Imperial Japanese soldiers, given what Japan had done throughout Asia. By early 1946, the Soviet system had organized approximately 2,000 labor camps spread across the USSR, specifically to house Japanese prisoners. These weren't concentrated just in Siberia, though that's where most ended up. Prisoners were also sent to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, the Ukraine, and even regions near Moscow. They were distributed based on where the Soviet economy needed labor most desperately. The camps themselves varied in size, but most held between 500 and 2,000 men. The Japanese prisoners were ordered to build their own camps first, which meant constructing barracks in the middle of Siberian wilderness, using whatever materials they could scavenge. In many cases, this meant cutting down trees in sub-zero temperatures while living in tents. A former prisoner named Hideyuki Aizawa, who later became Vice Minister of Finance in post-war Japan and served in the House of Representatives until age 84, described what he called the death march in snow during his first weeks of captivity. We were dropped off at a train station late at night, where the snow was 2 meters high. The march began as snow was falling, with no knowledge of destination. If you fell asleep during the march, that meant death. Some soldiers stumbled to the ground and never woke up. Occasionally, wild dogs or wolves were running alongside us, looking for corpses. The march lasted several days. Out of his original unit, about 15% died before they even reached their assigned camp location. The work itself was brutal and diverse depending on camp assignment. Some prisoners were sent to log timber in Siberian forests. Others worked in coal mines. Construction battalions built railway lines, roads, buildings, and entire towns from scratch. Agricultural details worked farms in Central Asian republics. The largest single project involved over 200,000 Japanese prisoners who were assigned to construct portions of the Baikal-Amur mainline railway, a massive infrastructure project that would eventually span thousands of miles. Every camp operated under the same basic structure. Work quotas determined food rations. If your unit met its production quota, you received your full ration, about 600-700 grams of bread per day, plus thin soup. If your unit failed to meet quota, rations were cut. This created a vicious cycle. Weakened men worked more slowly, which meant lower production, which meant reduced food, which further weakened them. The food itself was unlike anything most Japanese soldiers had experienced. A memoir from a prisoner named Itsuka described meals where what we fished out of our soup bowls was often not meat. It was not unusual to find goat's feet, hooves, or fragments of animal heads chopped up with an axe. I can imagine the genuine surprise of somebody who found a goat's eyeball in his soup. Prisoners supplemented their rations however they could. They ate wild mushrooms until several deaths from poisoning led camp authorities to ban foraging. They ate insects, grass, anything organic that might contain calories. They scrounged through Soviet garbage bins for vegetable scraps. Some prisoners grew so desperate, they ate bark stripped from trees. The Soviet camp administrators were under pressure too. Each camp was required to be financially self-sufficient. The guards' salaries were directly connected to whether the camp met its work quotas. This meant guards had every incentive to drive prisoners as hard as physiologically possible. Prisoners worked 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours per day, depending on the season and the project. In summer, Siberian days are long. But so are winter nights. During winter months, prisoners worked in darkness, in temperatures that regularly dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. The Japanese had been issued uniforms for subtropical and temperate combat zones. They had no winter clothing suitable for Siberia. Many prisoners wrapped their feet in rags because their boots had disintegrated. Frostbite was endemic. Prisoners lost fingers, toes, ears, and noses to cold exposure. Some lost entire limbs. Medical treatment was minimal to non-existent. Camp infirmaries had almost no supplies. Soviet medical personnel were themselves overwhelmed trying to serve their own population. Japanese prisoners with serious injuries or illness were simply left in barracks to either recover on their own or die. Many chose the latter. The exact death toll remains disputed even today. Soviet records, released decades after the camps closed, certified approximately 60,000 Japanese deaths during the detention period from 1945 to the mid-1950s. But those numbers only counted deaths the Soviets officially documented. American historian William F. Nimmo, who spent years researching Soviet camp records and cross-referencing them with Japanese military registration data, estimated the real number was far higher, approximately 254,000 confirmed dead, with another 93,000 simply missing and presumed dead. Men who were registered as captured in Manchuria but never returned to Japan and appear in no Soviet death certificates. That's 347,000 men, more than half the original prisoners. If Nimmo's numbers are correct, and multiple independent researchers have found his methodology sound, it means the Siberian camps had a higher death rate than Gettysburg, Iwo Jima, and the Normandy invasion combined. Except these deaths weren't from combat. They were from systematic neglect, overwork, malnutrition, and exposure. The deaths were concentrated especially heavily in the first winter of 1945-46. Japanese soldiers accustomed to milder climates faced Siberian winter without preparation, without adequate clothing, without sufficient food, and while being forced to perform hard labor. The death rate in some camps during those months exceeded 20%, but physical suffering was only part of the Soviet strategy. Stalin didn't just want Japanese labor, he wanted Japanese communists. Starting in 1946, the camp system implemented intensive political re-education programs designed to convert Japanese prisoners into supporters of Soviet-style communism. Soviet political officers conducted mandatory daily classes where prisoners were taught Marxist-Leninist theory, shown films about the evils of capitalism and Japanese militarism, and encouraged to engage in self-criticism sessions where they confessed their crimes against the Asian peoples. Some prisoners were receptive. These were mostly younger soldiers who had been conscripted late in the war and had watched the imperial system send millions to pointless deaths. For them, communist ideology offered an explanation for why the war had happened and who was truly responsible. The Soviets identified these converts early and gave them special privileges: better food, lighter work assignments, positions of authority within the camps. In return, these Japanese activists helped Soviet officers run the re-education programs and identify prisoners who were resistant to political conversion. A prisoner named Junpei Gomikawa was one such convert. He spent years in the camps, was thoroughly indoctrinated in communist ideology, and returned to Japan as a committed Marxist. He joined the Japanese Communist Party and became part of a disruptive political force in post-war Japan that strongly opposed the U.S. occupation and Japan's new military alliance with America. But most prisoners weren't converts. They were survivors trying to stay alive long enough to go home. They attended the political education sessions because refusing meant punishment. They recited the required slogans because it earned them a full meal, but they didn't believe. One prisoner, the poet Yoshiro Ishihara, wasn't released from a Siberian camp until 1953, 8 years after the war ended. When he finally returned to Japan, he wrote powerful poems not about Soviet ideology, but about the lack of resistance in Japan to the ultranationalists who had driven the country to war. His anger wasn't directed at communism or capitalism. It was directed at the Japanese people who had allowed leaders like Prime Minister Hideki Tojo to seize power without meaningful opposition. The re-education program created a split among prisoners that lasted even after repatriation. Those who had embraced communism in the camps returned to Japan as political radicals. Those who had resisted returned angry that anyone had collaborated. Meanwhile, another problem was developing that would affect both groups. Japan didn't want them back. While Japanese prisoners were dying in Siberian camps, post-war Japan was being rebuilt under American occupation. General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Japan in August 1945 as Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. His mission was to demilitarize and democratize Japan, which in practice meant dismantling everything connected to the imperial military system. The occupation government faced a massive repatriation challenge. Over 6 million Japanese military personnel and civilians were scattered across Asia, from Korea to Southeast Asia to the Pacific Islands. American and British authorities worked to return these people to Japan as quickly as possible, but the Soviets refused to cooperate. When American officials asked the Soviet Union to release Japanese prisoners and allow them to return home, Soviet representatives initially claimed they held only about 105,000 prisoners, a number everyone knew was absurdly low. They also insisted these prisoners were being re-educated before being returned to civilian life. Throughout 1946 and 1947, the Soviets did release some prisoners, but only about 170,000 total, and they specifically chose which ones to send back first. They prioritized prisoners who had converted to communism, calculating that these men would destabilize Japan's conservative post-war government. The strategy partially worked. When shiploads of repatriated prisoners arrived at Japanese ports, particularly at Maizuru on the Sea of Japan coast, authorities noticed something disturbing. Many returnees were openly hostile, uncooperative, and spoke enthusiastically about Soviet ideology. Some refused to properly reintegrate into Japanese society and instead joined communist political organizations. This created a backlash. The Japanese public began viewing all returning prisoners with suspicion and contempt. If you came back from Siberia, you were either a communist sympathizer or someone who had somehow survived when better men had died. Either way, you were tainted. The Japanese government's response made things worse. American occupation authorities had ordered the dissolution of Japan's military pension system as part of demilitarization. In October 1946, Japanese officials informed returning veterans, including amputees and permanently disabled soldiers, that they would receive no pensions, no preferential treatment, and no recognition for their service. Instead, they would be eligible for welfare as indigent persons under the Daily Life Security Law. For men who had sacrificed years of their lives and their physical health for what they believed was service to the emperor and nation, this classification was devastating. In Japanese culture, accepting welfare carried intense social stigma. It marked you as a failure, someone who couldn't practice self-help, and had become a burden on society. Disabled veterans, men who had lost arms, legs, sight, or suffered other permanent injuries, found themselves completely abandoned. Many dressed in white kimonos or wore their old military uniforms and stood on street corners in cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto, playing Japanese military songs on instruments and soliciting donations from passers-by. They were beggars. The same men who had been told they were the shield of the empire were now begging for coins to survive. In 1950, the occupation government implemented the Law for the Welfare of Physically Impeded Persons. Veterans hated this even more because physically impeded implied they were either mentally unsound or had congenital disabilities, both of which carried heavy stigmas in Japanese society. Veterans organized the Wounded Soldiers Association in various prefectures and began lobbying the National Diet for restoration of pensions and recognition. By this point, American policy toward Japan was shifting because of the Korean War. The U.S. wanted Japan as an ally against communism, which meant rebuilding some military capacity. In July 1950, occupation authorities ordered Japan to establish the National Police Reserve, which later became the Self-Defense Force, with 75,000 men. Suddenly, the same military service that had been condemned and dismantled was being reconstituted. For veterans who had been told their service meant nothing, this reversal was psychologically crushing. New soldiers were being recruited and paid, while veterans who had actually fought were still classified as indigent beggars. The discrimination wasn't just governmental. Private employers often refused to hire returning prisoners from Siberia. Companies were suspicious of their politics and worried they might be communist agitators. Even prisoners who had resisted Soviet re-education found themselves unemployable because they couldn't prove they hadn't been converted. The final group of Japanese prisoners wasn't released from Soviet camps until the mid-1950s. Some individuals were held even longer. A man named Toshimasa Meguro was imprisoned for 8 years in labor camps. Then, after his release, was ordered to remain in Siberia. He wasn't permitted to visit Japan until 1998, 53 years after the war ended. As late as 2015, Japanese officials were still identifying former prisoners living in remote parts of the former Soviet Union who had never been able to return. Some had started families in Russia and chose to stay. Others had simply been forgotten by both governments. But even for those who did make it home, the trauma lasted forever. Medical researchers studying Japanese Siberian internment survivors have documented something that shouldn't surprise anyone, but somehow still does. The survivors never fully recovered. Men who survived the camps had nearly twice the cardiovascular disease risk and mortality rate of Japanese men who weren't imprisoned. They suffered elevated rates of peptic ulcers, psychosomatic disorders, and premature death. The chronic malnutrition, exposure to extreme cold, and psychological trauma created permanent physiological damage. But perhaps worse was the silence. Most survivors didn't talk about what happened to them. Japanese culture valued emotional restraint, and many men believed that discussing their suffering would be seen as complaining or weakness. Families often had no idea what their fathers or grandfathers had endured. This silence had consequences. Researchers found that avoiding discussion of traumatic experiences is associated with worse physical health outcomes. The men who buried their experiences died younger and suffered more. Some survivors channeled their experiences into art. A painter named Kazuki Yasuo spent 5 years in Siberian camps. When he returned to Japan, he created a series of powerful paintings depicting emaciated prisoners in snow-covered landscapes, men who looked more like walking skeletons than human beings. His work forced post-war Japan to confront what had happened to prisoners in a way that words couldn't. Others wrote memoirs, though many weren't published until decades later. The novelist Toyoko Yamasaki wrote Fumochitai in 1976 about an Imperial Army staff officer captured in Manchuria. The book became a bestseller and was adapted into films and television dramas, finally giving mainstream Japanese society a window into what the survivors had experienced. In 1993, Russian President Boris Yeltsin publicly apologized in Tokyo for the inhuman behavior of the Russians toward Japanese prisoners. In 2005, the Russian government provided Japan with microfilmed records of 940 Japanese prisoners who died in camps, including names, dates, causes of death, and burial locations. The Japanese government began DNA testing on remains in Russia in 2003. They estimate approximately 55,000 Japanese died in the camps, though, as I mentioned earlier, independent researchers believe the real number is far higher. As of today, more than 32,000 remains are still unaccounted for. The irony, and perhaps the lesson, is that these men were defeated not by the enemy they trained to fight, but by the peace that followed. They survived combat only to be destroyed by the political calculations of the post-war world. The Americans who imprisoned Japanese American civilians in internment camps eventually apologized and paid reparations. The Soviet Union that worked Japanese prisoners to death in Siberia eventually acknowledged it happened. But Japan itself, the nation these men fought for, never fully reconciled with what happened to its soldiers after the war ended. There's a question that haunts this story, and maybe it should haunt all of us who study war. What do nations owe the soldiers who fight their battles? The 600,000 Japanese men sent to Siberia believed they were dying for the emperor. Then they were told to surrender for the emperor. Then they were abandoned by the emperor's government. They were worked to death by the Soviets, feared by the Americans, and despised by their own people. They had committed themselves to a military culture that promised honor in death and glory in sacrifice. What they got instead was starvation, frostbite, communist re-education, and a homeland that saw them as either traitors or failures. More than half died in camps. Most of the survivors carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. And the real tragedy is that their story, this massive catastrophe involving over 600,000 men, is barely mentioned in most World War II histories. We remember the atomic bombs. We remember the Pacific Island battles. We remember MacArthur accepting surrender on the USS Missouri. But we forget the hundreds of thousands of men who survived the war only to be consumed by what came after. If this story changed how you think about what happens when wars end, not how they're fought, but what happens to the warriors when the fighting stops, then subscribe. Because there are dozens of stories like this that history has buried. Stories where the aftermath mattered more than the battle. Stories where survival was just the beginning of suffering. Hit that subscribe button, because if we don't remember these men, who will?